was like, damn.
Check out. All right, welcome back. We start? We start? Okay, good. Thank you. Welcome back. Welcome back. We are continuing a discussion of zoning. And I want to briefly review from last class the use districts, the area districts, and the height districts. We talked about these last week, but a couple of you said you want to review it, so I'm happy to do so. I like to think of these districts as kind of like an overlapping pyramid or Venn diagram, where in U1, you have the least choices. And in U6, you have the most choices, right? So in U1, you can only build a one-family house. In U2, you have a choice. You can build a one-family house or a two-family house. In U3, you have more choices. One-family house, two-family house, or an apartment building, and so on, right? It goes up. As the number goes up, you have more choices of what to build. Now, as a practical matter, people don't want to build one-family houses next to warehouses, right? That's generally not going to happen. At least in theory, it can happen. All right, everyone get the idea of the use districts? Go ahead. Okay. The height districts work in a similar fashion, right? So there's H1, H2, and H3. If your land is zoned as H1, you're limited to 35 feet height. You can't go higher. If your land is zoned as H2, you can go 35 feet, you can go 40 feet, you can go 50 feet, right? You have more choices, right? So if you have a taller two-family house, maybe like one of these like skinny townhouses, you can put that in H2 area. H3 is cumulative. You can build at 30 feet, 35 feet, 40 feet, 50 feet, 60 feet, and so on. But you cannot go above the 80-foot ceiling. Right? So it works in the exact same way. Max?
Is that like the actual number, or is that just like a number?
These are the numbers from the case.
Oh, yeah.
Remember what that case was called?
Yeah.
Okay. Village of Euclid, the Ambler, right? We spent about half hour on the case last week, right? These are the numbers from that case. Everyone within the height districts? All right. The area districts work in a very similar feat. The area districts define how much space, that's how many square feet, needs to be devoted to a particular property. Right? This is going to sound obvious, but I'll say it. The more space that you require, the more expensive it will be because you pay generally per square foot for various pieces of real estate. So if something is zoned as A4, you need 900 square feet. Right? Something zoned as A3, you need 1250 square feet, and so on. A1 is the largest. So the numbers are kind of inverted, but it works the exact same way. What does that mean? If you're building a one-family house, you might be required to have a lot of space surrounding the house, space in the front, space in the back, and so on, which increases the cost. These districts in particular are designed to make it very expensive to live there because you have to buy a lot of empty real estate that can be filled with grass and not much else. Okay? Okay. Everyone with me so far? All right. Now keep in mind that all three of these will overlap. So you might be living in an area that's zoned U1, right, with H1 and A3, right, which tells you you can build a one-family house up to 35 feet, but you need a lot size of 2,500 square feet. Okay, everyone with me? Now today, the area districts are done actually even a little bit trickier. which requires what's called a set-off, right? That is, how many feet must there be between the front of your house and the street or the sidewalk, right? It's called a set-off. How much feet must be between your house and your neighbor's house, right? How much feet must be between your house and the driveway? There are all these various intricate rules that require you to purchase a lot more land than you actually want to have. So think of the case we have today where they buy a land in New Jersey and it's not big enough to build anything. Indeed, it can happen that you might buy a plot of land under a zoning regime and you can't build anything. Why? Because the house has to be a certain number of square feet, but the lot isn't big enough to fit that house. Let me say it again. You might have to build, let's say you have to build a house that's, let's say, 900 square feet, right? I'll just make up a number. And let's say your lot has only 700 square feet on it. You can't build anything on that lot. Or let's say you're required to have, I'll just make up a number, 20 feet between your house and your neighbor's house. If you give the full 20 feet of distance, your house shrinks under 900 square feet and you can't fit it onto the lot. Right? So when you have all these overlapping rules governing use, height, and square footage, area, plus the frontages and set-offs, you can't build on your lot, which is what happens today. We go into variances and those other sorts of things. Right. So it's entire. One second, Fernando. It's entirely possible that you might buy a plot of land that is unusable. You can't build anything on it in accordance with the zoning laws. Yes, Fernando.
The frontage, the offset, the terminology, will we need to know or be able to determine it for all the different jurisdictions?
Oh no, God, no, no, no. I would never do that to you. No, I mean, I would.
It'll be clear.
I think it would be clear. I think I've actually given you a specific offset because those are actually pretty easy questions, right? Requires math as well, which makes it hard. But
I didn't mean like the
can't think.
I
Yeah.
know, like, the terminology like offset.
Yeah. Offset and set off, they're used sort of interchangeably, right? But these are terms used to describe how much space must exist between your home and the street, the sidewalk, the neighboring properties, and so on.
So, with regard to like the offset or the setback or whatever we're using, let's say you have your fence and then from that property line, you have the setback or the offset.
Uh-huh.
Let's say the structure, like the house itself is within compliance with that, but then they pour concrete past that setback. As long as it's not past the property line, it won't be an issue. But once, or if it crosses, would that be an encroachment or?
Right. So I think, Fernando, I think the way I'd look at it is you measure from where the boundary of the property is, right? If they decide to come closer to your property, that's not on you, that's on them. Right. In other words, if they decide to in other words, let's say 20 feet on each side and they extend their property 10 feet, you are still 20 feet from the boundary. They're not. In fact, you as a neighbor could sue them for violating the zoning ordinance.
The reason I'm asking is if that wasn't a situation like you just described, since they're the ones in violation of that, then would that potentially cloud my title?
No. Well,
because now.
No. Okay. To be very clear, the 20 feet, whatever the number is not counted from where the other person's house begins. It's from where the property line is. Right. So you're only responsible for what's on your land. You can never be held responsible for what your neighbors do. That would be a horrible regime. Imagine if your neighbors screw up and now your title's a cloud on it.
Could it potentially cloud theirs?
Well, just to be clear, we're using this word cloud a little bit lightly. The title's still marketable, right? There's no latent defect, but as a practical matter, you can't build on it, right? So you can go camping, right? You can do other things, but you can't actually build on that property. We will do a case on the takings clause where the government says you can't build on certain property near water, right, near the ocean. But they say, oh, you can go camping, right? Pitch a tent, right? So you can still use your land, you just can't build on it. And that's actually some courts accept that as a rationale of why there's no taking, because you can build a tent. All right, everyone get the interaction, the use districts, the height districts, the area districts with the set-offs. It gets very tricky. And that's why we have today's class about variances, because sometimes things just get really messy. And there needs to be a little bit of flexibility in the process. Playing the joints, as we say. Okay. All right, so let's just try this question. We should all get this one correct. And if we don't, we'll be in trouble. Let's try this one. Question number 1. Okay. That didn't work. Try this again. Okay, try this again. Okay, there it goes. Okay. Question 1. A developer can build a one-family home in land that is zoned U6. True or false? All right, another 10 seconds. Stop it here. So we got good, 100%, 95%, very good. Right, I actually just gave this answer 3 minutes ago, but it's correct. In land that's zoned U6, you can build whatever you want. All right. Now keep in mind, you still have nuisance doctrine, right? Don't forget nuisance doctrine. If you knowingly build a one-family home across street from a toxic waste dump, you have some nuisance problems, right? And that's the coming to the nuisance doctrine we've talked about in torts and other classes, right? You can't knowingly build your property for residential purposes in an area where it'll be inhospitable or inhabitable, I should say, to people. So just keep in mind nuisance. It's very easy to mix up a question for the exam on nuisance and zoning. They go together actually very well, and I can pair them up pretty naturally. Okay. Ben?
So, if you are like one of the first people to build on a U6
Yeah.
and you build a family home and then other people come in, but since they're in the U6 zone and they start building factories, do you still have a claim on U6 or does still?
Well, let me put it this way, right? If you are I'll say grandfathered usage, right? You've been there for a long time. You cannot be liable for coming to the nuisance, right? But I could imagine a court saying that because this area's been zoned U6, you should hit the trails, right? And it may not be safe for you to stay there anymore. Especially if the government zoned that area for U6, knowing full well that resident people live there. And when I say U6, that's sort of a broad category. You might have a specific zoning for sewage waste dump, right? Or water treatment facility, or like, garbage dump. That's a specific zoning category. So it's not even just any industrial, specific types that are not safe for human habitation. Good? Are we good? All right, let's move on. All right, so far we've discussed how zoning can be very, shall we say, rigid, right? These rules can be very strict. And very often people are sort of stuck, right? That the zoning laws don't have a lot of flexibility of what can be built and where. The topic for today is how to give a little bit more flexibility in zoning codes, how to make them less rigid and more, pragmatic, how to make things work a little bit better. All right, so the first issue I want to discuss is the issue of the pre-existing non-conforming use. The pre-existing non-conforming use. What is that? Just define it in your own words, because the definition is a little bit tricky. A pre-existing non-conforming use.
I just got booted.
I'm sorry, what's going on?
I just got booted out of my.
You got booed out of iClicker. That's not fun. All right, well, about 20 of you put an answer, so it's not working consistently. I'm sorry. If it doesn't work for you, that's fine. I don't ever actually grade these. Just write down your notes. All right, I'll give another 10 seconds. And who's up next? Where's my going around the room? No one remembers? Are you next?
I'll go.
All right, I'll just start down here. Why not? All right, Max, what's your answer? Okay. Sarah, what's your answer?
I put that as, the properties which doesn't conform with that surrounding.
Okay, so let's break down. What does conform mean? Doesn't match what?
Doesn't match the, general norm of what
Not just the general norm.
the
Doesn't said
zones.
right. The phrase non-conforming has a lot of meanings, I suppose, but at least here it refers to you're not in compliance with the zoning code, right? You are violating the zoning code, right? Now, it's often not always clear whether you're violating a zoning code, right? There might be some very particular measurements. You know, are you 1 inch over a line, right? Maybe the height district is 30 feet and you're like 30 feet and 3 inches, right? There often are very close calls whether you're actually violating it. But we say generally if you're non-conforming, you're not in violation of the zoning code. Now, Patty, let me ask you, what does pre-existing mean here?
That it was there prior to the change,
What change?
or like prior to an ordinance making it
Correct, right? Zoning laws are not eternal. They've not been around forever, right? A lot of them were created in the early 20th century, and the city might modify it or expand it or change it. What do you do with pieces of property that were in existence before, that is prior to zoning law? Okay.
you would usually grandfather them since.
Correct. Good job. Thank you, Patty. Right? So how do you deal with these pre-existing uses that do not conform to the zoning code? You grant what's called a grandfather status, right? You say, okay, you were here before the zoning law. We're not going to make you comply with a law that didn't exist at the time. So you get grandfather status. You can keep your usage, not indefinitely, but you can keep it, right? Grandfathering status is very valuable because it allows one lot to do something that their neighbors cannot do, right? And when you have a grandfather status, that's basically what a pre-existing non-conforming use is. That is, your property is being used in a way that violates the zoning law, but because that usage was created before the zoning law went into effect, you can keep it. Right? But again, I said it's not forever. So let's say you make a significant renovation where let's say your lot size is too small, right? And then you decide to put on a deck. You're still too small. But if you make a substantial alteration, you can lose your grandfathering status. Right? Let's say your grandfather to use a restaurant, right? The area doesn't allow restaurants. And you suddenly decide, know what? I don't want a restaurant, I want a factory. Guess what? Changing the type, the way that your property is being used, you'll lose your grandfather status. There's even an example in the book of a restaurant that's called Lundy's in Brooklyn. I've been there. It closed for almost 20 years. And all these grandfathering statuses. It basically was just vacant. There was a vacant building for 2 decades. And they said, we're reopening again under the same name. We get to keep our grandfathering status. And it gets a little tricky about how that works. Really?
I understand that, but then how does that play with when the book runs like
it does run with the land, right? So if you own a grandfathered property and you sell it to someone, the grandfathering process, the grandfathering status moves over, right? The case I mentioned, Brooklyn, was strange because it was abandoned and it was basically known in privity, right? Think of it this way: the original owners just up and left, and then someone said, "Okay, we're just going to basically buy the land." I have been at a tax sale. I can't remember the specifics, but they just bought it. It was just no one owned it, and they were able to then build up the restaurant again. Yeah, right. But if you change the usage, you can lose the grandfathering status. Right. So if you have a prior I'm sorry, I said it wrong. A pre-existing non-conforming use, it's a mouthful. A pre-existing non-conforming use, you can keep your usage going forward. Amanda?
So the loss of status in the text you're saying about, so you sold the defense of the property to the vendor of the loss of that, would that still apply if you divided it to an air
No, if an heir inherits it, you keep it.
Okay.
But the litigation often is over how much change can be made. So I'll give you an example, right? Let's say I had a case like this when I was clerking many years ago. There was a garbage dump in downtown Cincinnati, right? It's been there for 100 years, right? Before zoning even existed. Bless you. There would never be a zoning board that approves a garbage dump in a downtown area. So it would never happen today. But it's been there for a while. Okay, then they started to do recycling, right? Recycling wasn't a thing 100 years ago. It didn't exist, right? And there was litigation over whether recycling was a substantially different change in the usage that they lost their pre-existing use. And I think, don't quote me, I think the court said you get to keep it. It was close enough, right? But it's almost like it's a judgment call, right? Do you get to keep your pre-existing? It was very valuable, right? They had a lot right by the downtown area that all the neighbors want to destroy and get rid of. But I think they said recycling was close enough.
Thank you.
You're welcome. All right. All right, and the reason behind grandfathering makes sense, right? We have a general principle in American law that we don't change the rules after they've been enacted. So maybe you studied in criminal law or con law, that you have ex post facto. Did that come up anywhere? Right, ex post facto generally applies in the criminal context, which says if a law was enacted after your crime was committed, you cannot be prosecuted for violating that law. Right? In other words, you can't change the law after it violates. Use a very current example. Our good friend Alec Baldwin, he was making a movie in New Mexico, right? Tragedy. He shot someone. Very difficult question on mens rea. I actually think it's a very hard case. But after Baldwin, well, he claims he didn't pull the trigger, but whatever. After a bullet flew out of Baldwin's gun, I'll just say that. So after the bullet flew out of the gun he was holding, New Mexico changed the law in that they added a mandatory, I think, 5 or 10 year sentence for this type of crime. And it seems they did it to go after Baldwin. And then the DA legit charged him with violating a statute enacted after the crime occurred. No go. So actually the lawyers for Baldwin, who I've worked with before, are very smart. They're like, hey, wait a minute. And they just got that charge knocked off. So now Baldwin's looking at maybe 18 months or something much less. But again, it's a general idea is you're only, what's the expression? Ignorance of the law is not an excuse. Good. The law must be set. You have to know what the law is when an act occurs. So when you built your garbage dump or you built your adult bookstore, as it were, in the next case, you read the law, you understood what the zoning code says, and you complied with it. Okay? But there are exceptions to this general principle, right? And that's the next phrase. So question 3, please. What is amortization? It's a good word. What is amortization? Okay. Okay. All right, another 10 seconds, please. All right, Jose. What is your answer, sir?
The continued use of lawful
In your own words.
basically that to keep using the property for a specific use.
And then what happens? What happens after the period of time runs out? And what if you don't change it?
Yes, you're in violation of the zoning.
Yeah, that's my next question. What happens when you're in violation of a zoning ordinance? What happens to you? Well, it's not a crime, but it's perhaps even worse. The court can hold you contempt, right? They issue an injunction to make you change it. All right, very good, Jose. Let me summarize. Amortization is a very big fancy word. What it means is, okay, you have a grandfather status. Congratulations. You can keep it, for some period of time. But by the end of that period of time, whatever it is, you must wind down your non-conforming use, right? You can either comply with the zoning code, great, or get out of town, right? You have to shut down. You can't do both. Sarah?
Are there differences in like general time periods?
Yeah, I'll get to that. I promise. I promise I'll get to that. Right? No, that's okay. So the idea behind amortization, actually, let me ask, Gwen, why do we have amortization periods? Why don't we just like grandfathering last forever?
That's like the surroundings change.
Yeah. So Gwen, let me ask you a follow-up, please. Should a community be forced to endure forever some non-conforming use? Why not?
Because what if it doesn't make that not beneficial to the area?
Good, very good answer. Thank you. Right. So the idea of amortization is we don't want to force a neighborhood to have this non-conforming use indefinitely. Think of the garbage dump in Cincinnati, right? It's been there for 100 years, more than 100 years now. Neighborhoods should be allowed to sort of evolve and develop, and the zoning plan is based on this comprehensive plan, so to speak. And if the city says we want this to be a residential area, then maybe the garbage dump should find a way to wind things down. Now, Sydney, let me ask you this question, please. Generally, when the government says you must shut down your property immediately, what must the government do? Pay just compensation, correct. Why? Yeah, what's that clause called? You said it, actually. You said the T word. Taking clause. Very good. Thank you. Right? Generally, when the government says we're taking away your property, shut down immediately, it's called condemnation. You've all heard the phrase condemnation, which means something like, it's in really bad condition, it's dilapidated, there's, rats and stuff, right? But condemnation doesn't really refer to property being dirty and in bad condition. It's a process. It's a process by which the government condemns your property, that is, they take it from you, and they pay you for it. They pay you just compensation. So here's the rub with amortization, and this goes back to Sarah's question, right? If the government takes your property immediately, say shut down today, I think everyone agrees that's a taking, they got to pay you for it. Okay. But what if they say, okay, shut down in 90 days? Is that enough time to come to compliance? What if it's not 90 days? What if it's 6 months, 1 year, 2 year, 3 year, 5 year, 10 years, right? 50 years. I'm just making up numbers now, right? At some point, some may argue that you have enough time to figure out alternate business strategies, right? Maybe move your business somewhere else. Maybe you sell it. Maybe you decide to modify your structure to comply it. Maybe instead of selling adult books, you sell Bibles. I don't know, right? You can think of you can think of different things to do with your business. The critics will say, well, wait a minute, I want to sell adult books, whatever those books were, right? Why should I be forced to change my business because of some zoning board that went sort of rogue on me and starts changing the rules every 5 seconds? Right. So this is the issue of amortization. Now, the case we have today, Pennsylvania Northwestern Distributors versus Zoning Hearing Board, is a case based on a state constitution, right? Based on the Pennsylvania state constitution. It is not based on the federal constitution. So I always make this point: state constitutional law is separate from federal constitutional law. They're not the same thing, right? So this is not a ruling on what the Fifth Amendment of the Constitution requires. It's ruling what the PA Constitution requires. I don't know that every state adopts the Pennsylvania rule. They don't have to. So just don't assume that this is the rule everywhere. I don't know what the majority rule is. I've not done 50 states serving amortization, but I think enough states have held that you don't need to have a bright line rule here. Okay? Are we good so far? All right, Daisy. Even the facts, please, in Pennsylvania Northwestern. I'm sorry to interrupt. For those of you who don't know, that means pornography. I have to just abundance of caution. They're selling pornography. This is before the internet, so you actually have to go to a place to buy it. And this was very controversial in conservative areas. Okay, I'll shut up. Just I don't assume you know everything. Okay, go on, Daisy. I'm sorry to interrupt you. I'm sorry. I think there's a plaintiff opened up, but just say the bookstore. It's fine.
It looks like it's for the town limited zoning to regulate adult commercial enterprises that's right after. That ordinance included an amortization provision requiring that the pre-existing uses that conflict with the amendment come into compliance with the policy.
Thank you, Daisy. Okay. So remember I mentioned last week the methadone clinic in Pennsylvania, which actually is not too far from where this took place, how the clinic opened up and they basically changed the zoning laws. Oh, you can't build a methadone clinic within, X feet of a school, right? And they moved the facility to the outskirts of town, and then the city said, there's a strip of grass, that's a public park, right? So you can't be near a park. And again, this litigated for years, and eventually I think the city lost on this one. But this case actually has some similarities, right? How to put this? Usually government moves very slow unless they want to move real fast. And when they want to move fast, they move fast. So let's just get the chronology down here. So on May 4th, this group opens up an adult bookstore. Moon Township, if you care, is near the Pittsburgh airport. If you're ever there, you can drive by. There's actually an email from a student discussing this area. Apparently it's still there. But it's a very conservative part of the state. I used to live not too far from there. So again, May 4th, the bookstore opens. May 8th, the government swoops into action. So the township announces a public notice that they want to amend the zoning code to target and regulate adult commercial enterprises. Again, this is 4 days after the thing opens up. So they're obviously doing this in response to this one company, right? No one, I don't think anyone will doubt that. And then about 2 weeks later, they hold a public hearing. And you can imagine the public hearing, people saying, we don't want this in our community. This is really bad. We have to zone this out of existence. So they adopt an ordinance that says any adult commercial enterprise cannot be within 500 feet of a school and other places. Now, let me just pause for a second. 500 feet is a pretty big radius, right? And if you say something can't be within 500 feet of a school, a park, a playground, or any childcare facility, in Western Pennsylvania, there's probably lots of places you can do that. In Houston, it doesn't exist, right? If you took a 500-foot radius around every park, school, playground, anything, right? There's virtually no places in Houston that would actually fit. New York City is even worse. You can't, right? It's just not even feasible. So why does this matter? On paper, at least, it says, oh, you can build it in certain places where you're not near schools. But in reality, there's almost nowhere you can build these facilities. You have to basically go to an industrial park where there's no one who actually lives there. And of course, it's probably worse for business and other things. I'll do just a brief tangent. Is that a hand? Okay.
Just out of curiosity, like for New York, would that radius include like up? So like if you wanted to build it like on like if you wanted to put your business on like a super high store of the building,
No, you measure the radius from the ground level.
so it wouldn't go.
No.
Not like a dome.
No. Okay. So just a brief detour. These have sex offenders, right? Very often they'll have conditions in terms of release. They can't live within 500 feet of a school, park, playground, and so on. That generally means they can't live anywhere, right? That there's nowhere actually that would not be within one of those places. Often they have to live basically in highway underpasses where there's no one nearby because that's the only place they can actually live. A related one is actually for sentencing for drugs, right? That is, if you had a case like this, if you deal drugs within 500 feet of a playground, school, and so on, it's a higher sentence, right? Okay, well, at least the public housing project where I used to clerk had a playground in it. So every single drug deal that happened near that housing project was an automatic enhancement for sentencing, right? So just keep in mind, you see these 500-foot radius sweeps. These are meant to basically sweep in everything. All right, so going back to this case. There was no way for this bookstore to come into compliance, right? Right? They were within 500 feet of a school, whatever it happened to be. And the city knew this. They drew it very deliberately to zone this adult bookstore out of existence. Okay. Right. You have school, hospital, nursing home, group care facility, park, church, place selling alcohol, which is basically any restaurant or any other adult commercial enterprise. You can't have two of these in a row. I guess it's too much. Okay. You also can't be within 1,000 feet of residential area, which is basically any house. Right. So there were very few places that could exist. And the city knew this, that they couldn't come into compliance. So in other words, they had 90 days to basically wind down their business and shut it down. So the entire sweep, the books are opened up on May 4th, and by May 28th, like basically 4 weeks later, the law goes into effect. That is lightning fast for any government I've ever seen, right? Government doesn't usually move that quick, but they want to get these guys out of town. All right, so then the board challenged the policy. So Maria, what did the both the zoning board and the trial court do here?
They upheld the compensation period.
Yes, why? Yeah, good. Thank you very much, Maria. So the trial court and the zoning board said that 90 days is reasonable. Which of course, we'll get to in a few moments. But they also sort of weighed the benefits and the burdens. And they said, okay, we agree that there's going to be a burden on the property owner, right? He just opened this new business, maybe took a mortgage out, right? Take a loan, whatever. Okay, boohoo, right? We care more about the benefits of the township, right? We care more of limiting this non-conforming use and having, I guess, this sinful thing in our community, right? The court said the real benefits of limiting the bookstore more than offset any losses to the landowner, right? In other words, if you want to run this business in our town, you have to comply by our rules, right? What thing? All right, this case goes to the Pennsylvania Supreme Court. Paolo, what happens on appeal? They do reverse. Why?
Because they said it was unconstitutional on the state. Just taking away their rights.
Okay, so why exactly was it unconstitutional? You're right. Just walking through that.
That's compensation.
Well, just compensation is the remedy if there's a taking, but why was this a taking? What was the court's analysis here? Ivan?
They said the provision deprives the plaintiff of lawful use of his property by force of seizing it. Source and base.
Good. Are all amortization provisions unconstitutional according to the court? Really? Which ones are okay?
There's a reasonable time.
Is that what the majority said? No. What did the majority say?
I thought they relied on Solon v. zoning.
They said no. Daniel?
The court held that the amortization and discontinuance of a lawful pre-existing non-conforming use is per se confiscatory.
Per se confiscatory. My goodness, that's my next question, right? What does confiscatory mean?
Basically, whenever I think of it like a taking.
You think correctly.
Yeah.
You're right.
So it's when the government takes your.
What does per se mean, Daniel? Think back to torts.
On its face.
Good, very good. Okay, so there are two terms here, right? Per se, which you've seen in torts, and other ones like libel per se, negligence per se, right? It means on its face, right? Automatic, right? That if you do this, there's no balancing, right? Think of like negligence per se, right? There's no balancing. If you do X, Y, and Z, you've committed an offense, right? What the court says in the majority is any amortization period is per se automatically a taking. It doesn't matter how short it is, doesn't matter how long it is. Any amortization period is a taking that will require just compensation. The government wants to force you to wind down a grandfathered usage, they have to pay you for it. And what does confiscatory mean? Think of like confiscate, right? Confiscatory, confiscate, it means taking, right? Max? Same thing. right? It means a lot of things in Latin, right? But by operation of this doctrine, any amortization period would be a taking. Now, I haven't mentioned the Sullivan case. That was a prior precedent, which I think the court kind of either ignores or disregards or maybe even overrules, right? Sullivan said that a amortization period is okay if it's reasonable, right? How long is reasonable? The court didn't really say. But here, the majority gets rid of any amortization principles, right? Any period is gone. So as a result, grandfathered uses in Pennsylvania must stay indefinitely until they lose the grandfather status, such as by making some sort of substantial change or renovation. And that's why to this day, as the little note says, the bookstore is still there and the neighbors are stuck with it. Maybe I just spitballing here, but one way to put a business out of business is not shopping there. I guess we're doing good business. So people living there, I'll leave it there, right? It's like you ever see there's like a Simpsons meme where Bart's working at a burlesque house and the grandpa walks in and walks right back out. Yeah, basically that. Just Google it. All right, that's the majority. Any questions? The majority. Yeah, Ben. I don't know. I'm not sure. Look it up. I'm not sure. I really don't know. I think this is unusual to have a bright line rule this bright. Caitlin, what does the concurrence say by the Chief Justice?
The concurrence, it said that he mentions like factors that should be weighed, but it wasn't included just the
90 days is too short. What factors can a court consider when deciding whether to assess an amortization period?
Like what you put into it and like the degree of effectiveness.
How offensive is it, right? Yeah. Very good. Okay, thank you, Caitlin. Very good. Thank you. So the court, the concurrence at least says we don't need a bright line rule here. We should have a balancing test. We don't need a per se rule because neighbors need flexibility. Is it really the case that 40 years later we still have this adult bookstore? We do, right? In other words, that these businesses can never be shut down until they perhaps lose their market share or some other reason to close. And again, I think as Hillary mentioned a few moments ago, the grandfathering status can sort of run with the land. So if this bookstore sells it to another company, it can pass from hand to hand. Okay. More choice words. All right. I was getting in trouble with this case. All right. What else? Yes, Hillary.
So when someone, I guess like a municipality puts out a zoning ordinance, do they put out the purpose of the ordinance? Because a lot of them say they want to look for. You interpret what you think they're trying to accomplish.
It's
Or do they tell you?
Yeah, no, it's a really good question. So one way this happens is you actually have a public meeting, right? And the zoning board usually has several members. Let's say it's 5 members. Each of them gives a statement, right? And those statements are on the record, they're transcribed, and those might be good evidence of what the purpose is. Maybe the ordinance itself says we are enacting a zoning ordinance for the reasons X, Y, and Z. Or more often they'll have what they call the comprehensive plan, which is some sort of a lengthy document explaining what we're trying to do. Now, this case is different. This is a one-off, right? The only purpose of this amendment was to go after this one company. So I don't think everyone knew what the purpose was, right? There was not a mystery here. But usually there's actually a lot of evidence to decide what the purpose is. Good point. Often a subjective inquiry, though, but what they actually intended. If you look at the next case, the other New Jersey case, they actually discuss the evidence, the conclusions they reach were not supported by evidence, right? So they can assess the record when they're reviewing these things. All right. Yeah, cool.
So you mentioned that we can lose the grandfather status by changing the use.
Yeah.
Can you lose that grandfather status by lack of use altogether?
Well, that's the issue of abandonment, right? That's the issue of the Lundy's restaurant in Brooklyn where they didn't even use the place for 20 years. and I think they kept it. I can't remember what actually happened. I remember I went to a party there in the mid '90s. This was a big restaurant in the '70s that just shut down suddenly. I went there in the '90s, many years later. Ben,
The book goes into like acts of God and it destroys the premises and they can't rebuild it if they say. I don't understand like how that is or like.
so you're saying if the force majeure an act of God, then you lose your grandfather status? Yeah, that sucks, doesn't it? Yeah, I think that's probably the right. I mean, I think that's what the rule is. Um, in other words, if you have your structure, you keep it there. Now, it does create some weird issues where, let's say, a property becomes dilapidated, and you're afraid to fix it because fixing it might lose your grandfather status. So actually, force you to keep a structure that might be not the best way. This is perhaps why amortization policies in the abstract are not bad. Well, they give you like a 10-year clock or 20-year clock, right? Eventually, you can move on. You have time to plan and sell your business to something else. But everyone agrees 90 days is too short. They were trying to get these guys out of town.
Not just like an act of God, but what if you, like, say they choose to renovate and they choose to cut down? Did they, get their hand forced in that situation?
Yeah. If they're not too careful, they might lose their status and it's gone. And once it's gone, you lose it. Good. All right. The next topic that I want to move into is the issue of variances and special exceptions. All right. Question number 5. A variance can be granted if, and I want you to please fill in the blank. All right, what am I up to? I think Katerina, you're next. All right, Katerina. First off, let's just take a step back. What is a variance?
It essentially just allows the government or the zoning board to like create an exception to the zoning requirement.
Right. Why, just in the abstract, why might a variance process be necessary with a zoning code? Okay. All right. So the idea of a variance is if there's something unexpected that happens, right? You have a zoning code, it's fairly detailed, and then something happens that's not expected. In other words, the people who wrote the zoning code didn't anticipate X. All right. And the very basic fact of a variance is the word that Katerina used. Is there some undue hardship? Right? Is there some undue hardship? If we were to enforce the zoning code, would there be a hardship that's unfair? That's something really hard to deal with? If the answer is yes, okay, then we ask a second question, right? Right? Kayla, what's the second question we ask? The second element of a variance inquiry. Well, sure. All right, so the first thing we ask is, has there been an undue hardship? Then what do we ask? No. There you go. Good. So we ask ourselves, would creating a variance here that's creating some sort of you can do it, right? Would that affect the public interest, right? Would that affect the zoning plan? Would that affect the public good? And there are different ways of formulating this, right? Again, the idea of a variance is this is a one-off, a one-time thing, something occurred, there's some hardship, and almost like equity, right? Is there some fairness reason why we're going to give this person the permission to do something with their land? But there's still a constraint. You must think of the public interest, the public good. And if giving this person sort of a one-off exception would harm the public interest, no go. Now, I think what Kayla says correct is there's discretion by the zoning board. The zoning board has a vast amount of discretion. And usually the courts are deferential. In fact, the case we have here is very rare. To second guess a zoning board on a variance almost never happens. But it's New Jersey because nothing matters, right? I don't need to tell you that point anymore, right? It's New Jersey, just they're going to do the opposite of what the rule usually is, right? But usually zoning boards are given a lot of deference. And perhaps the deference makes sense, right? They're in the community, they see what's going on, right? They're familiar with the circumstances going, in that neighborhood. They know better. So getting a variance decision reversed is very rare, but it's New Jersey. And now, just to be very clear, when we say an undue hardship, that means a huge hardship. So think of it, remember the strict necessity standard with easements, right? Is it absolutely necessary? It's similar, right? Do you absolutely need this variance? Right? In other words, is the land useless without this variance? Okay, you get one. It's not enough to say, you know what, I want to build a bigger house because I like having more space. No, that's not going to work, right? It has to be something really difficult. And usually it means the lot's either too big or, I'm sorry, the lot's too small or your house is too big. You can't build. Perhaps another example might be, a wheelchair ramp, right? Imagine you need to build a wheelchair ramp and the ramp goes too far towards the curb. So your frontage is not enough, right? Okay, so maybe you get a variance in that case. Or you need a ramp on the side that goes on, close to your neighbor's lot and you don't have enough offset. But these have to be, through no fault of your own, in good faith. Imagine a person had an accident, they didn't wheelchair before. Okay, now they need a wheelchair, right? And that's what they're installing. The trickier ones is where you buy a lot knowing that you don't have enough space to build, right? You basically buy it knowing, and you buy it anyway. And that's sort of what happened in this case. All right, everyone get the general gist of the undue hardship standard. All right, let's do the first case, the Commons v. Westwood zoning. Grayson, you want to give me the facts, please?
Sure. So we have the husband and wife, the Commons.
What a good name, right? Really, the tragedy of the Commons in this case, right? Sorry, it's terrible. She's shaking her head at me.
They own this lot in this neighborhood. They owned it since 1927.
Uh-huh.
And in this neighborhood, a zoning ordinance was enacted in 1940.
Uh-huh.
They had it before the zoning. They were
was this a pre-existing non-conforming use? Correct. Go ahead.
And so they wanted to build a house on a single family home on the lot, and they weren't able to. They were missing 30 feet in total frontage area with 5190 square feet. They just didn't meet the
Right. Let me just pause you there for a second. I'll come back to you, Grayson. This is sort of like the area districts in Euclid, right? Your house must be a certain number of square feet, fine. But you also must need a certain number of feet on each side of your property. And it's impossible, given the lot size, to build enough square footage and still have enough offset frontage. Go ahead, Grayson.
And so, because they weren't able to build, they tried to sell the lot they had to their neighbor. They didn't buy it.
Nope.
They tried to buy half of the other lot
Nope.
next to them. They didn't sell, and so they were just left with this empty lot. And I forget how the deal came about, but they tried to sell it to this guy,
Weingarten, yep.
Saying that he'd be able to build in the house. I don't know how they were able to make that promise. I forget if it's stated.
I don't think it is. Yeah.
They say you're going to be able to build in this lot, and it's like, okay.
That'd be some fraud there, right?
Yeah, and so he has a lot. He can't build.
Can't do anything.
You go to court.
Okay. Good. Thank you so much, Grayson. That's very good. Right. So again, this is the dilemma, right? You must have a minimum lot size, right? And if you build a house of the requisite square footage, you're too close to the border. So he tried everything. He tried to buy the neighbor's lot, tried to buy some land in the front, land in the back. They couldn't do anything. And this is basically having your land zoned in what's called inutility. It's INUTILITY, inutility, meaning there's nothing you can do with the land. So I'm guessing the reason why the case is called versus Commons is that Weingarten sued Commons for, like, to Grayson's point, for doing something bad. Maybe it was a general warranty deed, who knows, right? But there was some action, perhaps some fraud or something, we don't know. Okay, so Elise, the homeowners go to the board and they ask for a variance, right? What does the board give them? Nothing. Why not? Now, just Elise, let me ask you a follow-up question. If they had built their house here that maybe was like 30 feet too small, something very, whatever, not too big, would that be a nuisance of any sort? Would they violate any covenant? Would any of the neighbors actually even notice unless they have a tape measure? Okay, good answer. So diplomatic, the last one, right? Probably not, right? But they said there's not an undue hardship. Jacob, what are they supposed to do on the property? What can they do given the denial of the variance? They go camping, sleeping bags, although probably public camping is against the law in that town anyway, right? All right, so this case is then appealed. Then what happens on appeal?
On appeal, this is a court, kind of have to look at, everything that's happening, and I think they're saying that maybe they need more information to see if they can build on it, or if they can get a variance on the zone.
Okay, then what happens?
Well, in the end, they just remand, and I think the person who wants to build has to like bring up plans and let them build.
All right, Ben, let me ask the question a little bit differently. Do you think the New Jersey Supreme Court agreed that there's no hardship here? There's a negative. Was there a hardship here?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Which I'm confused. Was there a hardship here, according to the New Jersey Supreme Court?
Yes.
Correct. Okay, good. Thank you. I think you said the opposite. I don't think that's what you meant, right? The court said that this variance would not violate any of the traditional purposes of zoning. There's going to be light, there's going to be air, there'll be open space, there's not any sort of covenants being violated. And they said that the zoning board drew conclusions based on, that were not supported by facts. And this is to Hillary's point, there's a record, and they reviewed the record very carefully in making their decision. Also, there are other houses in the neighborhood that also don't meet the zoning code that they grandfathered in. So you have all these other grandfathered properties, one more will not be so problematic. Then we get to the issue of the public good. Wafa, what is the public good? Oh, such a good answer, right? What is that? But who decides what's good for the public? The public, we vote on it? The people, do we vote on it? Is there a survey? Do we swipe right? What do we do?
The people kind of decide what.
How? Did they vote on this property decision? Who voted on this one? It's like ask went to police powers. How's the zoning board to know, Wafa, what the public good is? Whatever they say it is, that's what it is.
Whatever they feel like is good for, like daily life, whatever.
So they get unlimited discretion to find the public good. So does the zoning board have unlimited discretion to define the public good, whatever they see?
Yeah.
So what is the public good? Hillary, you want to take a stab?
About like just defining public good.
Start there. I'll move on.
So I think public good is when you different things to serve the interest of the public.
And how is the zoning board to know what the public good is?
Well, I think they're probably one members of the community, and two, I think you consult with like the municipality, the mayor, and the people who run it.
So these meetings are public. People allowed to speak at these meetings?
Yeah.
They are. And what if everyone complains? Is that defined what the public good is?
I don't think necessarily defines it, but I do think that it gives a reasoning behind why they make that.
What if like, 3 families show up who live in that block? Like, we don't want him here. And then the only person speaking in favor is one who actually wants to build the property, Weingarten. Is that good enough?
I would say no.
Why not?
I mean, 3 out of how many? How many people live on the
I don't know, a couple dozen.
Yeah, I mean, that's like what percent?
Anyone else? Ivan?
I'd love to take consideration the impact on the characterization.
The impact on the characterization of the area. What does that mean?
Family, neighborhood, not just gonna have a sex store in the middle.
No, we're not talking a sex store. We're talking a house that's 30 feet too small. No, I'm serious though. Yeah, but these are family houses which are a little bit smaller. Alexa? In reliance on that ordinance. That's a good point. What?
It's like based on the zoning board and how it operates.
Right, but the zoning board wrote the code, so don't they get to define the? I mean, does the zoning board get to define what the public interest is by making a zoning code?
I just, does this go back to like the police tower and health and safety?
Who decides? I gotta raise your hand, guys. Daisy. So I mean, this goes perhaps to the next topic, but is there limits on what the zoning board can decide? All right. So here's kind of the rub, and I think all of you gave actually very fair points. The zoning board, I think, is best designed to decide, is there an undue hardship, right? They're there, they can hear the evidence, they can decide if there's some special situations that were not expected. The zoning board's on shaky ground when they say this is not in the public interest, because generally the zoning board does not define the public interest. That's designed for our elected representatives, legislature, and others, right? So I think the court reversed on basically both prongs, right? The court said that there does seem to be a hardship here. You can't use the darn land, and that the board never explained how a variance would impact the public good, right? The mere fact that a house is a little bit smaller would not necessarily affect the neighborhood, the character or otherwise, right? I mean, again, to Ivan's question, if you put an adult bookstore in a residential neighborhood, okay, I got you, right? Public interest, I'm with you, right? And I can't imagine, I only finish the sentence, why you would need a variance for an adult bookstore, right? Okay. There it is. We got that. Okay. There it is. All right. All right, everyone get the analysis. All right, again, this, oh yeah, Lloyd, please go ahead.
Wildly strong, or does it just depend on their influence with the legislature?
Well, the zoning boards are often, someone mentioned the members of the community, depends who's running it, right? So you can imagine, oh God, we have a case coming up, I think maybe next class or the class after, I can't remember, where like you have a bunch of architects sitting in the zoning board. And they're very, very distinct ideas of what good taste is, and what good design is. And they put people through hell to try and meet their requirements, right? If you're in a small town, these are people who are volunteering. If you're in a place like Houston, or if you're like in West University or a place like that, these are some very smart, affluent people on your zoning board who are going to know what they're doing, and it's going to be hard to comply. And oh, by the way, if you hire the right construction firm, I'm sure you'll get your variance. Look, it's how these things work, right? This isn't our reading for next class. You'll see it for the next one. But if you know who's in the zoning board, you know which architect firms to hire, which construction firms to hire, who will get it through the finish line, get you your permit. Fernando.
This case kind of made me think about the recent changes to like what HOAs can and can't do in places. And one of the issues they were,
This we're trying to get changed with the selective enforcement. Like you were kind of like targeting who they would approve.
I'm not familiar with these.
Architectural like changes or
Yeah.
people's use of their property.
I'm not familiar with these changes. I haven't seen those.
Oh, okay.
Send it to me later. I'll take a look.
Okay.
Thank you. All right. Anything else in the first case, the New Jersey case? All right. Again, this is rare. It's very rare that a state Supreme Court will rule a zoning board, right? It just doesn't happen very often. These usually very deferential proceedings. But I think the politics here is such that the neighbors want to keep out the newbies, right? That's sort of what we have to happen here. Now, suppose if you really want the variance, you could flood the box. At the meeting, you bring all your friends, say how much we really need this variance, right? You can have people speak in your favor. That didn't happen here. Julianne. Sure.
So, are they appealed to their own zoning board?
Correct.
From there it got.
The trial court.
The trial court. So the trial court has review over this.
Yeah, but it's deferential. Yeah,
Okay.
it's not de novo. I mean, it's maybe questions of law are de novo. Questions of fact are reviewed deferential. I don't know the exact standard. Okay, everyone with me? All right, so that's what a variance is. And then the variance, again, be very clear in your notes, it's for the unexpected situation where there's some unforeseen hardship, right? That's what a variance is designed to do. But then we have a special exception, right? Let's try this one. True or false? A special exception can be granted if the property owner demonstrates a substantial hardship. True or false? All right, let's see what we got. Stop at 5 seconds. All right, this one's false. About 2/3 of you got this one right. Do not confuse in your notes a variance and special exception. These are very different. Variances and special exception are different. Variances are premised on hardship, on unforeseen, tragic circumstances. By contrast, a special exception is not based on hardship, not based on unforeseen circumstances, right? A special exception is mechanical, right? The legislature creates very specific rules, very specific standards, if you will. I will not dare say factors or elements, right? Very specific standards by which the board has to decide. If you can check off the boxes 1, 2, 3, 4, you get your special exception. Again, a special exception is not based on balancing, not based on hardship. They're very distinct standards to satisfy. And if you satisfy those standards, you get your special exception. It's not about discretion. It's not about balancing tests. It's meant to make it very simple. And again, while a variance is about unforeseen, unexpected circumstances, special exception is the opposite. With a special exception, the legislature says, aha, these issues will arise and you should give a special exception if X, Y, and Z are present, right? So a variance is unforeseen. Special exception is foreseen. It's anticipated. Okay. Now, again, the state legislature designs the special exceptions. They are going to be enforced by the zoning boards, right? The zoning boards will decide, you check box 1, do you check box 2, do you check box 3? Okay, you get your special exception. But, and here's the big but, the zoning board cannot go beyond the scope of their authority. This is a concept known as delegation, which you may have studied in con law, maybe not. You guys said the non-delegation doctrine? No? Okay. So the idea of delegation is that usually legislature has power. And they can exercise that power, they can write laws. But the legislature cannot delegate or transfer the legislative power to another branch. Okay, again, the legislature has some powers, but they can't give them away. So this works in one of two ways, right? What happens if a zoning board tries to exercise legislative power? No go. Doesn't work, right? A unelected zoning board cannot act as a legislature. They can't write codes, right? They cannot write the laws. It also works the other way. What if the legislature gives the zoning board the power to write codes? Or the legislature gives the zoning board broad discretion to grant special exceptions? Does not work. Unlawful delegation of power. This is what we call ultra vires. I'll just write the word over here. Okay. Not ultra virus, ultra vires. Ultra vires means beyond the scope of delegated authority. Ultra vires means beyond the scope of delegated authority, that the zoning board went too far, that they tried to exercise a legislative power or they tried to do something they not supposed to do. Okay. So the special exception, it's very precise, right? Very precise. Do you satisfy the conditions laid out by the legislature? If yes, you get it. So classic example is like a parade permit, right? The city might have a policy that will give you a parade permit on certain days at certain times. You check the box, you get your permit. The government can say, you know what? I don't really like your group. We don't really need a parade for, I don't know, St. Patrick's Day. We're going to just cancel your permit, right? First Amendment for sure. But the government cannot do that. They cannot arbitrarily deny something where there's very specific bright lines. Okay, so we're going to get the idea of the difference between a special exception and a variance. People confuse these in the exam every single year. So I'm warning you, don't confuse them. Variances for hardship, unforeseen. Special exception is for things that were foreseen and you have to meet certain factors. Special exceptions are also called conditional use permits. Conditional use permits, CUP, you'll see that also. There's either a special exception or a conditional use permit.
So earlier when you said, like, let's say you weren't handicapped and then you become handicapped, you would use a variance. But if
Correct.
you move to the town and you are handicapped and there's something about like ramps, you would use a special exception.
If one exists, one may not even exist.
So then if not, you would use a variance.
Yes. Right. You can only use a special exception if the legislature enacts one. Right. So maybe the legislature has a policy about constructing ramps with regard to the set off, and you could satisfy that. Right. Again, in order for a special exception to exist, the state legislature must create it. It cannot be created by the zoning board. The zoning board acts like a JV legislature, to quote Justice Scalia, right? It's acting ultra vires. Actually, I think Scalia called one of the administrative agents the JV Congress or something to that effect. I'm paraphrasing it. I miss him. Okay. Good. All right. So someone who's next? For Ben. Yes, you've been waiting patiently. I'm sorry. You want to give me the facts, please, in Cope, the town of Brunswick? It's in Maine.
Qualify for an exception, and the board said that they meet the requirements 2 and 4, which is
Okay, so just Handra, just step back. What were the 4 requirements in the special exception statute, please? Okay.
the original law.
Good. Uh-huh.
Evaluate the
Yeah, that's a character I mentioned a minute ago, right? Okay, very good. Thank you, Alejandra. So there are these 4 factors, right? And the legislature seemed to give the zoning board the zoning board a lot of discretion, right? I think Fernando, you're next. Fernando, what's the problem with the second prong, that it won't adversely affect the health, safety, and welfare of the community?
I think this was based on the meeting there, is that correct?
Tell me.
Where they had discussed and evaluated the different issues regarding the area, surrounding businesses.
Why would building an apartment building in the residential area adversely affect the health, safety, and welfare of the people? Spell that out for me, please.
Why would it affect the
Health, safety, welfare.
the people in the apartment complex?
Well, the apartment people, there are no people in the apartment. It doesn't exist yet. So I'm
Right.
guessing that it's those surrounding area. Why is there a problem here?
I guess to me it was like it was unclear.
Yeah,
at the
sure.
time.
Well, put your cynic hat on for me. Can you put your cynic hat on for me, please? What do you think they might say? You know, if you put them under oath, what do you think they would say? Maybe under a deposition is a better answer. Right? What would the
The lack of specificity which they were addressing.
they want to build an apartment? You're being too generous, Duke. What's going on here?
Well, this is what we were talking about earlier, where they didn't have the authority to do this.
Correct.
And so when you say they violated 2 and 4,
Well, yes, they violated 2 and 4. But why? If you had to say, what's the rationale of why they violated 2? Right? What would the rationale be given? Why do they think that an apartment complex would alter the health, safety, and welfare of the people? What's the argument? You guys are being too generous. Johnny, be bad. No, I'm sorry. Sorry, it's not Back to the Future, Ben. There we go. There we go. We got it. Okay, we got the right answer. Sorry, John. Your cousin's gonna love this one. This is a case. This is a case where you say one thing out loud and there's another thing going on in your head, right? The reason why they oppose an apartment building is not because they'll bring disease and pestilence and dirt and stuff. It will lower the value of their properties, right? This really goes to number 4 as well. When you see alter the character of the neighborhood, what they mean is property value, right? You can just take that one to the bank, literally, right? In almost every case where we will study character of the neighborhood, it discusses property value. Now, again, maybe adult bookstore, I'll go along with it, right? But talking about people who live here, right? But they're probably poorer people. But they can't say that out loud, right? So they'll have other things, like, for example, they'll say traffic, they'll say noise, they'll say congestion, they'll say lack of parking. You know, you can run a mile long, right? But at bottom, the reason why they have this rationale for number 2 and number 4 is because of property values. Okay, now, SAL, what's the problem, though, with the board even considering factors 2 and 4? Why are these factors problematic?
Legislature should have handled.
Correct. Can the legislature allow a zoning board to decide what's in the public good and public interest? Okay, now I give you a trick question. What's the second prong for variance? The second prong for variance. Okay, so here's where kids often get tripped up, right? When a zoning board is deciding a variance, they sort of can't consider the public good, right? We just said that 5 minutes ago. But when you're doing a special exception, you can't. Again, for variance, there are 2 elements, right? Number 1, substantial burden, substantial hardship. And then number 2, would granting this variance infringe on the public interest, the public good? This is my question to Wafa a few minutes ago, right? You can do that for variances. But for the special exceptions, you can't have discretion of that nature, because then you're delegating to the zoning board the legislative power. So it's sort of weird on these case-by-case basis. When it's unforeseen problems, they have this discretion. But when they're enforcing a conditional use permit or a special exception, they do not have that discretion. That's a tricky point. Not obvious. The book makes no point in clarifying that, but there you have it. All right. So the question becomes one of delegating. The legislature must decide what's in the public good. They cannot have these broad categories like public welfare in general. It's too vague. It's too much discretion. Again, you can have this language for a variance about public interest, general welfare, but you cannot have this language in a special exception. You have to have very specific standards that can be checked off box 1, 2, 3. So you can imagine, to use an example, right? just use Hillary's example a few minutes ago. Let's say the city has a special exception to install a wheelchair ramp, right? Does the person have a disability? Yes. Does the person require a ramp that extends too close to the curb? Yes. Okay, you get your special exception. Congratulations, right? They're mechanical. They're automatic. There's no balancing. It's not like, well, how much you really need this ramp? I mean, can't you kind of just like, crawl up the steps, right? I'm being somewhat facetious and perhaps even a little mean, but with a special exception, you're denying the board this discretion. Okay. Questions on the main case? All right, again, don't confuse variances with special exceptions. They're different. Variances are for unforeseen hardships. A special exception is when the legislature in advance authorizes certain non-conforming uses. Again, variances are for hardships that are not expected. The special exceptions when the legislature in advance approves certain non-conforming uses. Good. All right. All right, we have one more case. We'll finish. Brylan, give me the facts, please, in state versus city of Rochester.
There was a plot of land ordered by single-family homes, multiple dwellings, and there was also an empty lot that was for institutional use,
What does that mean?
supposed to be used for institutions.
What's institution?
It's like a business.
Hospital, yeah. The Mayo Clinic is, by the way, Rochester, Minnesota is the Mayo Clinic. You've heard of it? Very famous hospital. All right, go on.
So, but the track was supposed to be for residential use, I think.
Good.
And the owner wanted to build luxury condominiums, and so he applied for a reason.
And but these are for the doctors living in the Mayo Clinic. All right, go on.
And that rezoning application was approved, and the property was rezoned. And neighbors of this area appealed, and they called the decision an administrative or quasi judicial act.
Okay. All right, very good. So, I mean, this is a very typical situation, right? We have land that's zoned for basically single-family homes, and someone wants to build a 49-unit luxury condo area, and he needs to have a rezoning, right? Needs to have it's not just a variance, it's not a special exception. Wants to have the land rezoned altogether to have high density residential. The city council approves the application and passes the ordinance. There's no reasoning, right? No explanation, no finding. So this is Hillary's point. They kept this one quiet. The minute said, well, this will expand housing and it'll be in a good location. But what happens? The neighbors appeal. Whenever a zoning board does something, neighbors can actually litigate the case. So the neighbors opposed this construction. All right. Generally, zoning boards are given deference, right? The courts will defer to the action of the zoning board. It's almost a rational basis standard. But there's something called spot zoning. Sinclair, help me out, please. What is spot zoning?
So spot zoning is sort of like the legislature.
Oh, it's not the legislature here. Who's making the decision? The zoning board. Okay.
And that outside those spots, that's where the legislature comes into play. So it's like, to me, it seems like a half and half.
Well, we usually speak, Sinclair, with a comprehensive plan, right? Is spot zoning consistent with the comprehensive plan? Right. Spot zoning is basically an exemption from the plan, saying, okay, we're going to have this area entirely one family residential because it's really important to have one family residential, except in this one block, right? On this one block, that is this one spot, we will have high density commercial or high density luxury condos. And there's a problem, right? We speak often with a rational basis, right? The government must act with some rational basis. What's the rational basis here? Well, the implication is favoritism, right? That this is being done for favoritism for this one company and only this one company and to no one else's benefit. And if you act for the benefit of only one entity, that may not be rational, right? You're acting almost like you're flipping a coin. You're favoring one person over another, right? Can the government enact a policy for the benefit of only one party? Well, they did here. So under the rational basis test, the answer is yes, right? The government can choose to bestow a benefit on one party. The court says if reasonable minds can differ, the courts will defer. Right? There's a very narrow and limited scope of review, and the spot zoning here prevails. So again, there are restrictions on spot zoning. It's not really spelled out, but it's kind of based on the due process clause of the 14th Amendment. The government cannot act in an arbitrary fashion, but here, giving the benefit to this one company had enough support for it, therefore it was not arbitrary and did not violate the Constitution. Questions? No? All right, let me wrap up, and we'll go home, or you'll go home at least. I'm here for a while. When we talk about zoning, we have to talk about flexibility. So we have a couple themes to think about. We have the idea of amortization, which is a wind down period in which any grandfathered or prior non-conforming uses have to come into compliance. And at least most states, I think, have a reasonableness standard for amortization. It does not become a taking immediately. At least in Pennsylvania, it's a bright line rule. With regard to the variance standard, again, these are unforeseen hardships that arise unexpectedly. And the zoning board can decide, is there a hardship? And does this hardship, or would this variance affect the public interest? They do have a lot of leeway to balance things. With regard to the special exceptions, it's much less discretion, they're automatic. And the legislature has to give specific criteria, which the zoning board must comply with. And spot zoning may sound very unfair, but it gets done and it's very hard to stop. All right, anything else? All right, I have the exit polling up. I'll be in my office. You want to come say hi. Otherwise, have a lovely day. I will see you all on Thursday.